This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Tavares Strachan. The Bahamian-born Strachan creates ambitious projects that intersect technology, politics, and untold history. His work takes on many forms, but always challenges the viewer to question the validity of predetermined limits and narratives about accomplishments from the past. Working at the nexus of art and technology has led to his art being launched into orbit, as well as board seats at both the Rhode Island School of Design and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And now, a discussion about the generational effects of invisibility with Tavares Strachan. Tavares Strachan, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Tavares, normally whenever I speak with an artist, I like to start with a hypothetical, which is if you were at a dinner party seated next to somebody who has no idea who you are or what you do, how do you explain to them who Tavares Strachan is and what your work is all about?
I guess I would start by saying that I'm someone who is driven by curiosity. And I think that curiosity is what drives me to explore, as I've spent time in various kinds of exploration, from space training to deep sea diving to North Pole expeditions. And that same curiosity has led me to, my artistic practice and my curiosity and my interest in research. But I also think that curiosity has led me to think about limitations differently. And I think that's kind of how I would maybe begin.
Well, you mention limitations, and it makes me think about the fact that you grew up in the Bahamas. And, when you grow up on an island, I imagine your reality, your identity is kind of confined. It's a limited space. And in lots of ways, I see your work kind of exploring kind of the limitlessness beyond where you grew up. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think a boundary, for me at least, is defined as a place that your mind can't travel, right? That's the outline of the distance, the furthest distance your mind can travel is a boundary. And so I think one of the things, you learn living on an island is once you leave, how much of it is perceived limitation and not real.
That's really interesting, and it reminds me of this story. They used to tell it in cells. I don't even know if it's true, but the story that if you put a handful of fleas in a jar with the lid on, the fleas will try to jump out, and they'll keep bouncing off the lid of the jar. And after a couple of days, you can take the lid off, and the fleas, even though they're capable, will only jump as high as the lid of the jar.
Yeah.
There's just something about what you're saying there in terms of the limitations being in your mind instead of physical limitations. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that the flea analogy, I think in some ways is maybe the basis of the human principle of colonialism. Mm-hmm. That if you're in a position of power, you get to invent the problem and the solution all at once and take credit for both of them.
The topics of anti-coloniality and, even just, I had one guest one time who was talking about Benin bronzes, and, we kind of went into the history of the British Empire showing up and basically creating a problem for themselves to solve. I know that your work touches on colonialism. I think I see it a little bit more in your paintings sometime. Growing up in the Bahamas, was that something that was kind of always in the back of your mind, the relationship with the British Empire?
I don't know if it was in the back. I think it was quite prevalent. I think it was, and still is, embedded in the style of government, the uniforms that the fire department and police department wear, and the general nature of how, certain groups of people organize themselves, and where certain groups of people of certain, socioeconomic brackets live versus people who don't. So I think it's not only seen, I think it is implied and it vibrates in every aspect of that society. So I guess the question is there, is there a space on an island somewhere where there's not a colonial existence?
So, at what point in your journey did you realize that you were going to leave the Bahamas and that the world was going to be a bigger place with more possibilities for you?
Yeah, I think I was always gone. I think one of the beauties of being an artist, and there's lots of crazy, potentially negative things about being an artist, or at least existing in the contemporary art world. But I think what's beautiful about being an artist is, I think once you kind of sign the contract, the social contract, I think the the good parts of you acknowledge that that enterprise and that practice is about freedom. And like, what do you? So then the question becomes, what do you need to do to retain your freedom? And how do you just not become trapped by the thing that you are inspired by or driven by or love? And so an art practice for me is just like one that completely acknowledges that at least the principle of it is about freedom. And although we fall short of that principle on a daily basis, the practice is about trying to at least achieve that freedom. And I think that was just something that I was inspired by when I was just young.
I think it's really hard to put your work in a box because it takes lots of different forms. And your undergraduate was in glass, you paint, there's neon. Would you consider yourself more of a conceptual artist in terms that your work explores deeply certain concepts or themes, or how do you think of yourself?
I think the idea of a box is a condition of Babylon system. And I think Babylon can't put something in a box that Babylon didn't create, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I'm on a quest to find, the voice of the people, really, and to make work for a bunch of folks who've been ignored. And I think that the brutality of being ignored, I think, comes in many languages. So I think the multi-language approach only makes sense in a place that has just been, fundamentally ignored. And so I think the language that I'm speaking is the language of the ignored, and that comes in various forms.
I hate to sound like a poet here, but I feel like there's some things kind of hanging on that word of the one who's ignored. And I feel like the subject of your work are people who have been overlooked many times, and the exploration of who those people were is for the benefit of folks who have been denied the history of those people. So the one who's ignored is both the subject of the history and the one the history is written for, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I think there's this fundamental principle about how the West has decided to claim history as only things that have been written or recorded in particular ways that are comfortable to the West, and everything else, any kind of knowledge base or indigenous technology or way of thinking or making that hasn't been recorded in those particular ways don't necessarily enter the confines of historical practice. And I think that is one way of invalidating, multiplicity, or at least multiple ways of making and being. And I think that practice is a pretty brutal practice if you think about it, right? Like, if you say that if I have a particular dance technique and the story of my family has been captured in this dance technique, and we pass this on generation by generation. No, it doesn't exist within a book, or it's not on camera, but this is the way we pass on. This is the way we make meaning, right? And if the West decides in general that, or at least academia decides that, these principles are unworthy, so they don't get to be passed on to the next and the next and the next. And I think you see the harshness of the gesture of deciding that if something's not written word, then it doesn't enter the lexicon of language or history.
I mean, part of that is just, the fragility of oral histories, but part of that just keeps on occurring, when you look at, the appropriation that Elvis Presley took on in the late 50s, or a TikTok star like Charli D'Amelio claiming dance steps and not crediting where they came from, right? I mean, it's kind of pervasive and ongoing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think to me, I think it's just a question of how, like, what's the power of creative practice, right? And how far can it go to raise the vibration, really,
Sure.
on a lot of these issues.
When did you first realize that you had a passion for identifying these lost figures in history and building work around that?
I think it happened when I was in the Bahamas in college, and I realized that, like, a lot of what I cared a lot about wasn't really being covered in any way that was represented in mass or popular culture, right? And so I think music was a good kind of vehicle for that. And in the Bahamas, you had all the Caribbean music: merengue, rake and scrape, calypso, reggae, and that music was the story of the people. And it was just I think as the certain periods in history moved forward, like the Industrial Revolution, for example, I think we associated quality with volume, and so popular music or popular literature or popular film or had a way of saying, well, it was popular, so this is the most important things that we needed to pass on to the next generation. But anyway, it was in college where I was just like, maybe this material needs some attention.
Sure.
Like what about it? Like, what about the journey of looking into these ways of thinking and making? And maybe it was just a way of thinking about it as like a practice of human dignity. Like, how do you identify these practices that are not being held up, and how do you maybe hold them up?
This has kind of opened up a whole world of exploration for you, right? I mean, it seems like in many ways, as you dive into the past of these figures, it's allowing you to open a dialogue into some of the worlds of technology and exploration that these figures were working within, right?
Yeah. I read a headline yesterday. I think there were like a bunch of counties in America, I think on the West Coast, that were going to be, I think, hitting 125 degrees by the year 2050.
Wow.
And it was just like it's like a chilling piece of information. But I think the craziest thing now is we all feel like we're in this kind of moment of Armageddon. And I think, related to your question, I think for me, the question is like, how do we get off the treadmill in a way? Because I feel like one of the hardest things to do is just get off that treadmill of life. And like the feeling of like, what can I do if the general world is heading in a particular direction? Like, what stakes do I have? What sticks can I put in the fire or take out of the fire? What position should I play, right? And I think that's one of the massive questions about these histories, right? Like, so much of what we're experiencing has been experienced before on some level. And so how do we hit that vibration where we're connecting and feeling like we have a place and a voice and can impact the way that the world's going? It's almost like we've, to a certain extent, it's almost as if we've accepted the finality of Armageddon, right? And we'll go somewhere lighter, I hope, before this podcast is done. But I think artists, for me, I think artists, the thing that's saying, hey, like, maybe we could do some stuff.
So I feel like you've introduced me to some names that I should have known. For example, Matthew Henson. For listeners, who was Matthew Henson?
I think Matthew Henson is probably one of the most important explorers in maybe the past 150 years. He discovered the North Pole with Robert Peary, and in the early stages of that exploration, Matthew Henson's story was written out of that history. And in the latter half of the century, this story started to become more in focus. And the significance of discovering the North Pole to me is massive, because I think the North Pole back then in 1909, when it was discovered, was like going to space in a way. And it was just radical that this man of color was just out there, right? He was an out there guy. And I think this, this accumulated impact of knowing these stories for young people, I think, is profound, right? And so he really was someone who, when I discovered his story, was just blown away by it, like you are. And if you put it into context in terms of what the feat was, but who was doing it and when they were doing it, I think it tells its own story.
And it seems like a lot of the work that you've created around Matthew Henson, you utilize a lot of neon to create a depiction of a person in different forms that is, the neon takes on the role of the interior of the body. It's almost like the skin's been pulled back and the inside is depicted in these different neon forms. And I'm just wondering, is it just me that I'm reading into it that there's sort of an invisible man sort of analogy there, or is that something that you intended and hoped for me to glean onto?
Yeah, Ralph Ellison famously said that invisibility is when a society chooses to not look at something, right? I think it goes something like that. And I think that what's really amazing about artistic practice and like being able to spend time looking at work is that it has the potential to be super inspiring. It was inspiring to me. And having access to information and having access to these stories inspired my own desire to put these into the world and maybe motivate, people to act and do. And so, yeah, I think the neon work was a kind of a thought about electricity, a thought about electricity's relationship to invisibility, but electricity as actual, but also as metaphor. And then what happens if you can light up a figure, and what does light mean, right? What is the impact of being able to define space, right? Because we know that light defines space, right?
Right.
So if you take all of the light away from a place, then it's difficult for us to visually define that space in that place. So it becomes this kind of beaconless work. But I think I'm curious. I'm curious from the other side of this. Like, what vibrations are you getting when you're absorbing this work?
I think one of the things that's undeniably beautiful, right? I'm picking up on the invisibility, and if I were to think longer and harder about noble gases that are invisible, but when given a particular charge, provide that light source, and that gas was there. What was missing? It was the electricity, right? And its ability to be seen. I don't know. We can drill down in all sorts of ways, right? But
yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, I think so. So this whole conversation just makes me ask a different question about us having a conversation from the context of the contemporary art world, which we know speaks to such a small fragment of the population.
Right.
So, I guess my question is like, what's your position on, because I'm talking also, like, through the work I'm speaking, I'm trying to have a voice in the space. But how is it for you working, acknowledging, knowing, being aware that you're talking to such a small segment of the population, how be it important it sees itself. But like the folks that I grew up with back in the Bahamas and on the block, the art world's not talking to them at all. And I have to acknowledge that as a part of being an artist, right? In order for me to be successful to a certain extent. So for you, what's that like?
That's a really interesting question. So the question is, do I ever feel like I'm talking in an echo chamber, right? Like, am I just talking to an audience that's not listening? And and I feel like, you mentioned earlier about you brought popularity into the conversation, and I think it's interesting, even when we talk about the art world and we talk about what's popular in the art world versus what's significant. And I think sometimes people will put price tags on popularity that are bigger than price tags on the work that's significant. And I think in the end, the significant work is able to move people, and it's able to connect dispersed people groups and share ideas and philosophies and help people understand each other better and, advance the ball and make changes. And significant work, lasts, and it will be respected and understood a little bit better. I talk to people about work that was done 100 years ago, 500, 1,000 years ago. And some of the most compelling conversations are about context, right? And my hope is that someday someone will have to explain to someone that sees your work that, you have to understand the context that these people were invisible. They'd have to, that would have to be explained to them. Am I making any sense there?
Yeah. I think that the game piece of life is interesting. It's like we're sitting at a poker table, and you play, and there's winners and losers, and then the winners get to walk away with the chips, right? Mm-hmm. But in life, in actual life, you have all the wealth, the folks that are wealthy, that all those chips, when the game is over, they actually go back to the middle of the table, right? All those chips for us to redistribute at the end of the day, right?
Right.
And so I think that your thought makes me think of, the communication piece, like who are we talking to? And it's not necessarily an echo chamber. It's just that, like, there's a certain value and self-importance that's sometimes put on this small space that we're working in. But I think in the process of putting this uber importance on it, there's so many people that are neglected. But ultimately, I think for me, how do we want to make that space more inclusive and bigger? Do we want to talk to more people, or are we comfortable just talking to the same 5 people that go to Chelsea every weekend?
Right.
You know what I mean? And I mean that not just from the position of being an artist, just like there's so many fascinating ideas I find in creative processes that exist within the art world. I just think that for me, like, it's just it's like a fundamental question about where we're going, right?
In your work, I wouldn't say this about all contemporary artists' work, but your work really makes me think about education, right? It makes me think about arts education. It makes me think about, social studies, history education. And I feel like I've heard you refer to your work as almost being letters to a younger version of yourself. I guess my question is, when you think of your audience, do you think of your audience as being those folks on the Upper East Side, or do you think of your audience as being, someone that looks a lot like a 10-year-old Tavares in the Bahamas?
I think definitely, in order for us to have that discussion, I think we understand how do we define audience, right? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that the academia in general gets wrong about audiences is that, again, there's this misunderstanding of scale, that audience means big, volume, large. And it's almost embedded in the definition of audience when people say it. for me, an audience it can be super specific. You can be talking to one person, and I think the rest of the world is free to watch that debate between you and the other person. And so much of the best art I think that was created for a small audience. It's just all of us are watching that. We get to participate in that dialogue between these two or three or four entities, but ultimately your audience is, so what does that mean, right? That means that you can really make specific work, right? You can make work for the 10-year-old dude in the Bahamas or kid in the Bahamas. And to me, that's about the human experience, about human dignity, and about thinking about giving in a place that has been seen as less than. But then, yeah, the lady on the Upper East Side or West Side could come see that dialogue and find something enriching about watching that dialogue occur, right? But for me as an artist, me as the maker, I want to be specific about who I'm talking to. Mm-hmm. It's important, I think, to the quality of the work.
A lot of artists I talk to talk about leaving an open door for the viewer to insert their share and find a personal connection. Where do you think that shows up in your work?
I think Bob Marley and the Wailers is a good example of that. You have this little band in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, just making this crushingly good music. But it's the most unlikely style of music, and it's the most unlikely location to make music from. It's not like a music center. And, by the end of the 70s, going into the 80s, it's probably one of the most popular bands in the world, right? That's some crazy. When you think about that in context, that's like an amazing phenomenon, right?
Absolutely.
And when he and the Wailers are making this music, they're making it for the people living in Trenchtown and Watertown and Kingston, and he's making that music. But there's something about that music that just is about the human experience fundamentally, right? And that's not like it's more like a human rights issue than it is like a specific identity politics issue, right? It's not about Black people or white people or Asian people, or it's about people. His music is about people ultimately, right? Mm-hmm. And so that open door, I think, comes through the beat, right? It comes through, falling in love with the aesthetic, the practice of aesthetics, right? You ride the beat, and everyone can bob their head to the beat, regardless of where they're coming from, right? And I think that's one of the beautiful things of artistic practice and art making, right? Is that you get to bob your head to the beat, no matter where you're from, right? And that's kind of the genius. That's like one of the genius things about Bob Marley and the Wailers, right? They make this music popular that wasn't even a genre of music 10 years before it became popular. It wasn't even a thing. And not only was it not a thing, it wasn't happening in a major metropolis. It was happening on a small island. It's like radical to think about.
That makes me think again about how your work is compelling on a number of different levels, because I think you could be talking about the same things and it visually not be compelling. Your work is very compelling aesthetically and in terms of what the substance is. Sometimes, work is just visual. Sometimes it's a lot more heavy on the substance. But I feel like your work is balanced in that. And so I feel like when something is beautiful, people will linger and ask questions longer. Would you agree?
I think it's a tool, man. I think it's I was having a conversation with a friend about, there are tons of people who do community service. And some of them high profile folks that you never know they're doing this community work because they're so busy doing the work that they neglect to tell the story about the community work they're doing. Right. Mm-hmm. And so like community, like that kind of community service gets like a bad rap because people are like, it doesn't seem dope and cool to like be conscious of what's going on in the communities that you're living in. Right. And so I think the storytelling surrounding a lot of this work is actually what has been the thing that I've found to be the most challenging, but yet like the most potentially fulfilling, right? because I think we need to change the language surrounding how people understand certain kinds of practice, right? And once we could do that, then it becomes aesthetic in a way. It becomes beautiful. It doesn't become a side piece. It becomes the main dish in a way.
One of the pieces that you've created in the last several years is the Encyclopedia of Invisibility. First, maybe I could have you kind of describe that piece for listeners. But, also, how do you find the stories of people that have been overlooked? Because you can't go to the traditional resources because that's by the nature of the definition, they're not going to be there, right?
I think that was like 14 years at this point, 14-year research project to maybe reinvent the encyclopedia with material that has been either excluded or not looked at in a way, and to just maybe shift the gaze. So it looks just like an encyclopedia. It has entries, and it really was meant as a thought experiment. And I think your point about the material is there, right? It exists in the world. We're just maybe not looking at it. And how do we raise awareness around some of this material? And I think, aesthetics is a good way to talk about some of this material, right?
Sure. Let me ask you, and this is a little tangential, but it had me thinking when I was looking at your work, and that is in 2022, with the prevalence of fake news and relative truth, in the fact that as an artist, there are plenty of times when artists will create, say like Matthew Barney will create, characters and histories and narratives that didn't exist. Do you feel like you ever run up against the possibility that people will misinterpret some of these stories as being historical fiction versus being inspired by real people?
I don't know that matters. I think what matters is the context and the content. I think if there was an explorer who looked like me when I was growing up, I don't know that I would care whether that person was real or not. What I would care more about was what it represented. And that's the way I look at it. I think it does matter. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter that it was real, but I again, through the lens of me as a 10-year-old, so much of how you're learning exists within the realm and the confines of the edges of how far your imagination can go. And I think that, that imagination is really important. I think that is the missing link. I think the feeling of not being empowered, I think, is due to historical precedents, but it's also to do with like just the limitations of our ability to think beyond what we understand, what we know.
Your artwork has gone to space. At some point, you came alongside like a technical and science community, and it feels like there have been opportunities for you to kind of think big and be in dialogue with science. That has led to your work going to space. How did that opportunity come about? When did that dialogue first open up?
I'd been doing a lot of research regarding exploration, like I said, the North Pole, deep sea diving, and a lot of space work. And I was having a conversation at the LA County Museum with a curator named Christine Kim, who's a phenomenal mind. And then I think at the same time, the art and technology program at the LA County Museum was coming back on stream. And one of the people that it set me up with was a woman named Gwen Shotwell, who is the head of SpaceX. And we had a meeting, and I had this project in mind for a while because I'd been done the research on Robert Henry Lawrence. And I thought it would be kind of incredible to be able to put some version of him into space, some story about him into space. And it was one way of maybe unfixing history, right? Because I think so much of how we understand it is fixed, but it's not really fixed. And so it took maybe, it's like a 4-year process before, from the first conversation until the object ended up in space, maybe 5. And I think, I think there's like, that's like a testament to long thinking, just being able to work on things that, sometimes manifest themselves over distances. Because I think the solutions may not be human centric to a lot of the things we're facing as a society. The solutions may be a little bit longer than our capacity to think of them outside of 85-year time stamp. So it's just good for me. Like, it's a good way to exercise that principle, right, of long thinking. Anyway, that's in a nutshell. That's a little bit about that particular piece and how it started, and then how it kind of came to fruition.
And so the actual piece that was launched, it kind of resided in a satellite that circumnavigated the Earth for a while, but the object, I believe I saw that it was kind of based on like a canopic jar. Egypt, what? Mm-hmm. Canopic jars, when I think of they, in the process of mummification, they would take organs out, and there were like 4 different of these jars tied to different gods and whatnot. And what was inside of this vessel?
Yeah, it was taken to Japan, and it was blessed in a Shinto temple. And the idea was that we try to channel the spirits of Robert Henry Lawrence back into this jar, and this jar would then go into space. Yeah, that was it's this beautiful golden object. And so now it's a communication piece, and it sends information about its being back to Earth.
I believe I read that you're currently like on the board of MIT. It sounds like you have lots of opportunities to have conversations with people in the worlds of science and technology. And what is your sense of the scientist and technologist perception of who you are as an artist? And are folks in the science world curious about the arts? Do they see something in your work that is interesting to them?
I think it's a little bit of both. But I think for just for the sake of hazing, I have to say that I'm on the board of Rhode School of Design, also the vice chair. I just needed to say that, so when I show up to my next board meeting,
right,
they know that I'm representing. From this recent pandemic, I think one of the things that we're learning is that both art and science suffer from the same problem, which is they're both really bad at talking to the general public, right? And I think that's super interesting. I think that's like a we could bind together over that issue, right, or that point. I think generally artists are excited about science, and scientists are excited about art. And I think, but I think it's just a language barrier. And I think, in order to go into a favela in Brazil, you gotta speak Portuguese, right? Like, you can't go in there. And I think that's just the issue of human communication in general. It's like, how do you speak enough science to talk to a scientist? How do you speak enough music to have a conversation with a musician? How do you speak enough culinary arts to talk to a chef? Like, you could do it. We all listen to music. We're all involved in science in some way. Mm-hmm. And we all eat food. So why is it that we feel like we can't speak these multiple languages? That's the way I look at it.
I've read before that that most Nobel-winning physicists have their prize-winning ideas when they're still in their 20s, because it's back to the lid on the jar, right? I mean, the older they get, the more confined their thinking is. And I just feel like if I were a scientist, I would admire the art's ability to maybe explore abstract thought and creativity, because sometimes it's hard to get out of that paradigm. Is that a conversation you've ever had with folks in this world of science?
Yeah, I think the best scientists are incredibly playful, and they're quite interested in exploration. And then there's a bunch of scientists that are not so playful and not interested in innovation, and they're either just regurgitating material that they are familiar with or aware of. I think it runs the full gamut, um, you know. And so I think the piece that binds us all together is the human ability of innovation and creativity, right? I mean, I think nothing none of the innovations of the past 100 years have come from nothing but creativity. That's all creative thinking and human ingenuity, right?
Sure.
So I think they're just operating, everyone operating on a certain wavelength, they're operating in that wavelength.
What impact do you hope your work is able to have on the world?
I don't think about that. Honestly, I don't think about that at all. Because you know, I'm just doing the thing, right? And we'll sort it out later.
Right on.
I think that's for other people to decide, for sure.
So, Tavares, you recently had a show at Marion Goodman Gallery, The Awakening. Help me understand. There's now sort of like a second and third part that are going to be going on overseas. Can you kind of fill me in on that?
Yeah, the I think it was over the pandemic, a little bit before the pandemic. I started thinking about an episodic approach to an exhibition, and what happens if an exhibition can exist as, you know, as three parts. And I just thought, I was thinking about the arc of a day, and just thinking about also maybe realigning the cultural circadian rhythm. How do you get us realigned? And the awakening was the show that happened in New York, and it was about just basically this idea of awakening, waking up. And then in broad daylight is the next chapter in these three chapters, and that was about just, you know, what could happen in during the day, like